There is so much expertise available at the state and local level. There are resources available at the state and local level. There are people who have a role to play in election administration, even if they have never considered it part of their job. And even if that role is as simple as saying, I will stand up for American democracy. I will support the people who run elections, and I will not tolerate threats to that system. That is so important.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores the evolving state of elections and election security, how recent developments are shaping the way we vote and support elections across the country. Our guests today are two nationally recognized experts in election administration and security. Kathleen Hale is a professor of political science at Auburn University and co-director of Election Administration Research Center. Derek Tisler is counsel in the Elections and Government program at the Brennan Center for Justice, where he focuses on election security and governance. Welcome to you both.
Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah, thank you. Delighted to be here.
Let's start with a broad view. What do you see as the most pressing challenges facing election security today, and how have those evolved over the past decade? Derek, maybe we can start with you.
I think when we're looking at election security challenges, it really has been an evolution. I think a lot of people started to pay attention to this issue in 2016. And I think what came out of that was the big issues around cybersecurity. How do we keep our voting system secure, our election system secure? How do we put in place all these sort of modern best practices that we see around critical infrastructure to prevent against cyber attacks? And over time, those threats continued to evolve into more of the physical security realm. So especially after 2020, we saw an increase in threats and harassment directed at the people who run elections. More recently, in 2024, we saw bomb threats on polling places. We saw fires on ballot drop boxes. And so the story of election security is that you need to prepare for everything, but you can't necessarily tell what is coming next. Now, I think as we head towards 2026, one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing is the changing role of the federal government in this space. So since 2016, the federal government, especially through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has provided more resources and support to state and local officials to help them secure their systems, and has served as a central hub for information sharing as it goes from the federal, state, to local level. And this was a level of coordination and assistance that we hadn't really seen before from the federal government, but has made a really big difference in the ability of states to defend their own systems. Under the Trump administration, that role is changing. CISA and the federal government as a whole is starting to deprioritize that support for election security, has reduced staff that had previously been used to conduct trainings, assessments for state and local officials, and has also reduced funding for some of the information sharing networks that were built up. And so as we head towards 2026, a big responsibility of states is trying to figure out how to cover some of those gaps that have now been created.
Kathleen, Derek just provided a little bit of background and that there's obviously a period of massive disruption and change right now. Can you provide some background on what's happening in this space from your perspective? And then really tell us, how are election officials experiencing this right now, especially given the recent federal actions and changes to key security programs?
I'll add on to a little bit about your introduction of me, since over the last year, I have transitioned from professor at Auburn University to executive director of the Election Center, which is the National Association of Election Officials. We are the largest and only nonprofit membership organization in the space dedicated to election administration. We currently have about 2,200 members, and specifically in terms of what are election officials doing about these gaps that they're experiencing that Derek mentioned. At the end of August, 800 of them met in Salt Lake City for an annual conference to talk about and have community and share experiences. The gap that Derek mentions from the decline of federal presence in the space is real. And it's something that election officials are feeling. One, I guess maybe a good news way to look at it is that in many communities, blueprints have been laid down through groups like the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections and other community organizations that focus on crisis and emergency response. Those, to the extent that those efforts were supported by grant funds, everyone sort of always knew in the back of their head that they would have to replace that funding to continue the effort. And so the blueprint is there. The energy, the commitment and the energy is there. It's a matter of what I can attest to that from 5 days in Salt Lake City with people who were just so uplifting and uplifted to be with each other and share and know that they're in a community that understands their work experience, which is nothing like anyone imagined it would be 20 years ago or even when they started. So we know that information sharing works. We know that it builds capacity. We know that networking in physical spaces, in-person networking builds capacity. It's really smart governance. And supporting those kinds of efforts, I think, is going to be critical for the foreseeable future. Election officials are prepared. They like to be prepared. They thrive on being prepared, and they want to help each other prepare. So the interest is there, the commitment is there, and I think it's up to us to just wait and hear, provide opportunities for space for them to get together, and even something as simple as talking to each other for a day about what's going on in your jurisdiction and what kinds of things are you seeing. The relationships that were created by some of the grant-supported efforts around CISA and safe and secure elections, the relationships don't go away, but they also don't continue unless people continue to put the effort into them.
Information sharing is always good, and I imagine in this gathering that you mentioned, the real outcome was to think about how to improve election administration and election resiliency. Derek, you've written extensively about election resiliency. How do you modernize the election system, help officials adapt to challenges, and ultimately ensure voters can trust the process?
Yeah, so I think in terms of how election officials can best prepare, I think what Kathleen hit on about relationships, building trust, coordination, all of these themes are so important. And it's not just the fact that election administration in the US is so heavily decentralized across thousands of jurisdictions across the country, and each one having their own local election official who does the day-to-day work of running elections. And so what Kathleen talked about, where there has been so much more sharing of information, sharing of best practices, election officials helping one another anticipate challenges and put in place solutions to address those challenges. That's been so critical. What we have seen similarly within local jurisdictions, within states, is relationship building across the government, I guess, and a bit of a recognition that election security is a shared responsibility of officials all across the state. So election officials do the actual task of running elections, overseeing voting, counting those ballots. But in terms of how do they keep their polling places safe? How do they keep their offices safe? How do they keep their technology secure against any sort of vulnerabilities? There's a lot that other officials from law enforcement, from state IT, from emergency management, from all these different areas across government, they really have a role to play in helping put in place resiliency plans and helping to respond to any incidents that may occur. And I think as we've been talking to officials across the country, especially in response to this changing federal role in the election space, they've emphasized so much how coordination, relationships, building trust across government is going to help put you in a place where you can adapt to whatever challenge may be coming. If you already know who you can call on, if you have already tapped into certain resources to strengthen your systems as much as possible, you're going to be ready to respond. And as I said, the challenges that we saw in the last election, they're not going to be the ones we see in the next election. They never are. And so it's so important to adopt a a flexible approach to say if there is any disruption whatsoever that's going to interrupt people's ability to cast ballots, that's going to cause long lines, that's going to get in the way of counting ballots, we need to have a backup plan to keep things moving. And I think election officials really thrive in this responsibility.
We need something that permeates the conversation at the local level and at the civic level, with Rotary, with Kiwanis, with chambers of commerce. Communities should be proud of their elections. If you can be the tree city, you can be the election city and have it be something good. That trust factor is critical, and that's what those relationships are about. So, as Derek said, the new challenges are going to be different, and they need to be the kind of thing where I can pick up the phone or set up an email and reach out to Derek and say, "Hey, Derek, remember me? We worked on X together. Well, now it's not X, it's Y. What do you think? Can we talk?" It's not sophisticated. It's just the business of keeping up with the people in the circle who can help you.
And Derek, does the American public trust the process? And how does a local jurisdiction become known for election administration and good election administration?
Yeah, so I think the question of whether the American public trusts the process is a complicated one. I do think polls tend to show a majority of Americans do trust election results. I think what you tend to see is a dynamic where if your favored candidate loses, you trust those results less. And if your candidate wins, you trust them more. And that's unfortunately a longstanding pattern in American elections and something that's difficult to solve. I think the other trend that we tend to see, though, in these surveys is as you get closer to talking about your local level, your community, there's a lot more trust in elections, right? And so there's a lot of people who say, look, I know we do things right in my county, right? But I don't know how they do things over there. And I think this is an important dynamic to keep in mind. One is the extent to which, even though we have a decentralized election system, the fate of American elections, it's all sort of tied together. Whether people trust what's happening across the country has an impact in their faith in democracy overall. And I think it's important that state and local leaders recognize that fact. So absolutely stand up for election integrity in your community, but stand up for election integrity as a whole across the country is important. In terms of building trust in the local community, becoming, I think, as Kathleen put it, the election city, I think we've seen a lot of really innovative practices that election officials have adopted in the past 5 years or so to try to build trust. And a lot of that is just about welcoming the community into the process, holding tours at your office to say, hey, A to Z, this is how we run elections. And this is why we are confident at every step of the way that eligible voters are the only ones casting ballot, that everyone is only casting one vote, and that every single vote is counted accurately. We've seen a lot more use of video, for example, having video surveillance in counting facilities where at any time people can log in online and see what the election workers are doing during the process. We've seen just a lot more of election officials trying to go to the people in their community where they're already meeting, where they're already having these conversations and say, hey, ask me anything about elections. I trust in the process that we're doing. I'm confident in it. What questions do you have? And I think that has gone a long way. I think we've heard a lot of stories of individuals who were skeptical of the process, but when they were welcomed in, maybe they even served as an observer or a poll worker. I think a comment that these people tend to say who are skeptical and then serve as a poll worker is the whole process is a lot more boring than I thought it would be because it's just a tedious series of checks to make sure that you're doing everything right. So I think adopting those transparent approaches, those welcoming approaches, and approaching people in the community with good faith and say, we're confident in our elections and here's why.
Kathleen, what are your thoughts on getting to a more modern election system? I mean, Derek offered some insight onto innovative practices, but what else might be needed? Could it be structural? Could it be policy? Or could it be other mechanisms or elements that allow us to be more modern in how we approach our election administration?
I think this may be an unusual answer to your question. I don't have any structural suggestions, probably because I don't have any faith that there's the political will to implement any structural change that we could possibly consider. What I think is critical is that we walk into this space optimistically. We start from the baseline that everything's okay, and that if we hear about something happening, that our local offices can and will tell us what's going on. Most election offices do not have their own communications or public information officer. This is a circumstance where the size of the office matters tremendously. Cook County, Illinois, or even the city of Chicago, or Los Angeles County, you have oodles of staff. You have oodles of specialists. In a small rural county, it might be you and one other person. Some days it might be just you. So being able to meet the public's desire for information. So there are other ways to think about how you might do that. You might do videos, you might do press nights, you might have the local Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts come through and see what's happening. I feel sure that there's no one size fits all, and there's no one magic potion for this. It's retail. It's reaching out and offering every opportunity all the time that you can to have the public see what you do and know that the people who work in their election offices are the people they see in the grocery store. They're the people that they see on the golf course or out, in the park, that these are your friends and neighbors. And there's nothing nefarious happening here. These are people doing a hard job for, relatively speaking, not a lot of money. And certainly not their compensation doesn't include the kind of hazard pay that might go along with other public service occupations where you're literally risking your life to do your job.
It's important to make sure that election technology keeps pace with the evolving needs of election administration as well as security challenges. Elections are more dependent on technology than they have been in the past. And I think this is a really good thing. I think this has led to a lot of important improvements in the process. The adoption of electronic poll books has streamlined the voter check-in process, made it faster, made it possible to open vote centers and other innovative polling place approaches. Voting machines have obviously allowed for much faster and accurate vote counts. The adoption of online voter registration has made the whole process of registering to vote so much simpler, especially for younger voters who have learned that they can do everything online, right? And so all of this has been a huge improvement, but it does demand resources in order to make sure that you can continuously update this technology to meet the changing needs of election administration. After 2016, cybersecurity issues were brought to the forefront. One of the big issues that was identified was the use of paperless voting machines, systems that did not have any paper record of the voter's cast ballot, right? And there was a huge effort to replace this outdated technology to the point that in the last election, over 98% of all votes had a paper backup available. And that backup could be audited in the post-election process to confirm that voting machines are working as intended. But 2016 is almost a decade ago at this point, and the amount of money being made, especially from the federal government towards election administration, has only been declining since that time. There's a need for consistent, reliable funding to make sure that this technology can always be continuously updated. I think most people would be unhappy if they were still using a laptop that they purchased 10 years ago, right? They wouldn't expect it to quite operate in the way that they would want it to. We have to think of election technology the same way. We have to invest in this technology to make sure that it keeps pace.
And Kathleen, maybe you could share some of the lessons that we could learn from other countries about election administration, particularly around mail-in voting, voter ID, and just voter participation more broadly.
Our system of government, particularly our intergovernmental structure, is so much more robust than anywhere else on the planet. Even other countries that have federal systems like Canada or Mexico or Switzerland, there are places that have some of the components that we do, but none really that have the structure that we have embedded in our U.S. Constitution, our governing documents for the entire enterprise. Our system is both complex, interconnected, and intractable. I tell students and election officials all the time in certification classes, it's built this way. It was not built to be fast. It wasn't even necessarily built to be efficient. It was built to be representative. And so it is slow, slow. It's like turning a battleship on a dime. Sharing information in other systems about and with other systems in other countries is a good idea. We have so many issues here at home to focus on that it doesn't get lost, but it's sometimes a distant second in people's concerns about what's happening, because wherever you want to compare is smaller and has a more homogeneous population than we do, and often has a different party system, has a different system of representation, or plurality voting, or other tools that are designed to force compromise and conversation earlier and throughout the process than what we have here. Winner take all, first past the post is pretty brutal, and that's how we play.
Yeah, I think one specific example to add to everything that Kathleen is saying. So, mail voting, right? This has been something that has been identified where there are a lot of other countries across the world who don't allow any mail voting, and it's a very popular method in America. About a third of all ballots are cast through the mail. If you look at how mail voting was adopted in the US and where it became most popular, it's been mostly in the American West. And out there, you have huge areas of land with a very sparsely populated population of voters. And so that means that you can't put a polling place within a reasonable distance of every single voter. You just wouldn't have the resources to do so because the population is so sparse. And so for a lot of people, in-person voting is just not a convenient, accessible means of casting their ballot. Whereas if the ballot arrives in the mail, they can just put it in the postal system, which they rely on already for so many of their other economic needs or their just ordinary way of life. That's just a very convenient method. And that's why we see huge rates of mail voting out in the West. When you look at a lot of other countries that don't have the similar land area of the United States, the sparsity of population, maybe that method of voting just doesn't make sense for the voters there. So what it means to serve your voters' needs varies so much country to country. And I think even across the US, what it means to serve your own voters varies by state. And that's why we see such different policies from state to state.
There's a lot of work on this topic because it's important. The Brennan Center and R Street Institute recently released a joint report on election resiliency. Earlier this year, the Academy and the Brennan Center hosted an event around election administration. Derek, what does the future of elections look like, and how do we best prepare?
So I think the future of elections is a bit of a complicated question. I think we've seen some pretty rapid changes in election policies over the past 5 years or so. COVID sort of sped up a trend that was already occurring. Early voting has become more and more of an option that voters like to see in their states. Right. So we've seen a lot of rapid change in how elections are administered. And I would expect to see overall a continued trend toward utilizing these convenience options for voters. In terms of how to best prepare for challenges, one consistent thing is that even though elections have been such a controversial topic in recent years, in the 2020 elections and 2022, to some extent in 2024, these were well-run elections. Despite every challenge that came their way, election officials really did have backup measures in place to keep voters casting their ballots. We saw over 200 bomb threats to polling places or election offices across the country, in many different states. Despite this widespread challenge, there were no major disruptions to voting at all, in part because of these increased collaboration, relationship building between election officials and law enforcement, this rapid information sharing where when we started to see some of these communications, they spread through these networks to warn other election officials. Law enforcement was able to anticipate, investigate the threat, and keep matters moving. And I think this success story is so important. It really speaks to, again, the importance of collaboration. There is so much expertise available at the state and local level. There are resources available at the state and local level. There are people who have a role to play in election administration, even if they have never considered it part of their job. And even if that role is as simple as saying, I will stand up for American democracy. I will support the people who run elections, and I will not tolerate threats to that system. That is so important. And so I think in terms of looking at preparation, how can we build these collaborations? How can we build this coordination that will allow us to prepare for anything that comes? That's going to be the biggest focus over the next year and a half or so before the 2026 elections.
Kathleen, and my last question to you, good election administration is going to require good election officials. In your view, what makes a great election official today?
First and foremost, they believe in American democracy and they believe in adherence to the rule of law and to the ethical standards that underpin their conduct. They are that rare combination of very detailed, organized people. Some of it also involves curiosity and willingness to continually learn, to work with others, to work long hours with others, and to care about the end product of what you do. I've spent my whole career working with public servants in the research space and have never been so uplifted or prouder of a group of people than the election officials we have around the country. They are truly fantastic.
We just heard from two experts that there's reason to be confident in our election system, but we need to ensure we have reliable funding, continue to update technology, share best practices, and meet with the community to ensure that there's trust in the system. Thank you both to Kathleen and Derek for joining us today. Your insights are invaluable as we navigate the future of election security and democratic resilience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.